Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of the All Things Interesting podcast, where I bring to you the interesting stories of guests from a wide variety of backgrounds. On today's episode, former chief foreign affairs correspondent for the Wall Street Journal and author Jay Solomon returns. We discuss the recent escalations in the Middle East from the Soleimani killing, Iran's retaliation, as well as the possible fallout, impact to the nuclear proliferation treaty, and more. This episode was recorded around a month ago, so you may notice that some of the topics discussed are slightly out of date, but the events that we speak on are still highly relevant as they are still playing out on a regional and global level. So there's a lot of interesting points that kind of give a glimpse or idea as to how the dynamic in the Middle East region might unfold in the near future. So before we get started, if you enjoy the episode or show, please make sure to subscribe to the All Things Interesting podcast on iTunes, Google Play, Spotify, or your favorite podcast platform. And as always, feel free to follow me on Twitter at Tesher Cohen and Instagram or Facebook at All Things Interesting Podcast. So without further ado, please welcome back Jay Solomon. Welcome, Jay. Glad to have you back on the show today.
Are you in Phoenix? Where are you?
I am based out of Phoenix, yeah.
Are you a huge Steve Kerr fan?
He's a big figure here. I'm not a huge fan of him, but
I grew up with Kerr. He was my coach when I was young.
No kidding. Steve Kerr was your coach?
We had an interesting system. I grew up in a town called Pacific Palisades, and we had a league there, and the older kids who were in high school would coach the younger kids who were in like junior high. So yeah, 1 year Kerr was my coach, and I actually played on a summer league when he was going into his freshman year at Arizona. I was going to my freshman year of high school. We had this kind of league where the older guys would play with the younger guys. Yeah, I played. I don't know. I played like 10 games with Kerr.
Yeah, wow, that's crazy. That must have been an awesome opportunity because I went to the U of A also, and he's
a legend.
Yeah, he's a legend there. So
well, the whole Middle East connection too. His dad was assassinated by Hezbollah like his freshman year. I remember that.
What?
You didn't know that?
No, I didn't know that. I didn't dig that too far deep into his family history, but what's the story behind that?
Kerr's dad was a really famous Middle East expert, and he was named president of the American University in Lebanon, in Beirut. And this was like 1983 when the Israelis had invaded Lebanon, so there was a lot of, Israelis and Americans were targets. And yeah, it's like, 3 or 4 months after Kerr's dad moved there to take over the school, some Hezbollah guys shot him on campus.
Wow.
And that was the same night. I think Steve either played that night or the next night, and I think he hit like a really big shot against Arizona State as a freshman, and that was part of his legend, was that he played so soon after his dad died and hit this really clutch shot. So yeah, that guy had an amazing life.
Wow, that's incredibly sad. I didn't even know that was I didn't know that happened.
If you Google, New York Times wrote a story maybe a year ago or 18 months ago, just him talking a bit about how that impacted his life. And
I'm gonna have to pull it up after the call, but I know it wasn't Aaron Rodgers, but Brett Favre. I remember when one of his parents passed away. He played a game in Oakland, and he ended up having, I think, the greatest game of his career at that point. But it seems like a lot of people, when someone significant to them passes away, they end up kind of steering that towards whatever they're doing, and kind of, well, not only with Steve Kerr, but with Brett Favre, with games like that, they'll end up having amazing games. So
yeah, they get fired up. Yeah.
But yeah, overall, just really just tragic year so far if you think about it. I'm not sure if you've been following the news recently, but there's the Australia bushfires, there's the coronavirus, and then again Kobe Bryant passing away today. Also, again, the U.S. Iran kind of flames of war, which we're going to be talking about a lot more of today. But it's been a hectic year, and it's only been 3 weeks. But yeah, I want to kind of get your thoughts on the recent escalations in the Middle East, because for a moment there, people were pretty on edge. I mean, after like the retaliation for the Soleimani killings, it got pretty close. I mean, what are your thoughts on that?
I mean, I was a little less alarmist than some people after like killing Soleimani was a big deal. I'm not saying it wasn't, and it was a major escalation, but I've written a lot about Iran. I just didn't think they wanted to be in a situation where they could have a direct military conflict. I mean, I don't think Trump wanted it either, but I think, you know, they know. I think the Iranian regime knew that if they really hit us hard, Trump was going to have to probably retaliate, either hitting Iranian military up installations or oil installations. And in the current situation where their economy is already sort of in such bad shape, I was skeptical they were going to take action that would lead to, essentially an over war. And people were a bit alarmist at first, but they basically shot. They didn't seem to really try to kill Americans at that base. And so things, once that happened, it seemed like there was some de-escalation. And I always assumed that the Iranians would keep doing what they're doing, which is using their proxies to hit us. I think there was another Katyusha rocket attack on the Green Zone in Baghdad today. They might have gotten close to the U.S. embassy. So I fully expected that type of asymmetrical warfare. I was a little less alarmist that the Iranians would hit us, really directly.
Yeah, it didn't make much sense though, because I know prior to the retaliation by the Iranians when they shot the ballistic missiles at the two bases in Iraq, I believe, I remember Donald Trump tweeting out a message saying that if any Americans are harmed or any infrastructure by the Americans are harmed, then there would be a huge retaliation against Iran. And lo and behold, there was initial claims by Donald Trump that no injuries had occurred and that everything was fine. But after that happened, it came out that there were 34 injuries or 34 brain related injuries to U.S. troops in the region. And it kind of brings to question, well, if that's the case, then it's clear that nobody wants war, whether it be Iran or the U.S. in that case.
No, I mean that's those. I've seen those reports. It's a little unclear what, you know, if like this is how traumatic those brain injuries are. Any brain injury obviously is pretty big news, but I agree with you. I think both sides were looking for a way to de-escalate. Neither Trump doesn't want to, an all-out war with Iran a year before the election, and I think Iran, for the reasons I was just saying, um, doesn't want a direct conflict with the United States. It's the U.S. I mean, I've in my book and in my reporting, I argued that the U.S. has actually been pretty restrained militarily with Iran since going back the last 4 decades, considering some of the stuff the Iranians have done, whether it was taking American hostages at the U.S. Embassy in Tehran and 79, whether it was using their proxies to blow up the American embassy in Beirut in 1983 and then blowing up the U.S. Marine barracks in Beirut the next year, which killed 241 Americans. That was the biggest terrorist attack that ever targeted the U.S. before 9/11. And then there was the attack in Saudi Arabia on a U.S. oil infrastructure that also killed a bunch of Americans. So in response, the U.S. has not done a heck of a lot. We did have what's called the tanker wars in the 80s when the Iran-Iraq war was going on and the Iranians took steps to try to choke off commercial and oil traffic in the Persian Gulf. We did end up sinking some Iranian naval vessels, but it's been a pretty restrained response. I interviewed George Shultz for my book, and Schultz is hardly a raging hawk, but he was Secretary of State for Ronald Reagan when the Marine barracks got blown up, and he was like close to resigning because he thought we should directly retaliate against Iran, knowing that they were behind the attack on the Marine barracks. And
Mm-hmm.
instead, Reagan basically pulled out. And there's a theory, and it's a pretty strong one, that the Iranians basically learned from that um, episode that, wow, if you hit the Americans, it can be, if you hit them hard, they might pull back. And we saw them continue using asymmetrical warfare, certainly during the second Iraq War, moving all these IEDs into Iraq to target, using the Shia militia in Iraq to target our troops with those IEDs. And again, there were calls by some in the Pentagon for us to hit Iran in retaliation for the use of these IEDs, and nothing ever happened. So
Mm-hmm.
you could argue we've been pretty restrained.
What's the reason for that? That we're so restrained when it comes
To Iran?
a direct conflict with Iran.
I mean, I think it's for what a lot of pundits will say. It's they're a small country. They have a lot of capabilities asymmetrically to use proxies, to use to try to target the Persian Gulf. I'm sure the economic ramifications. If a war happened with Iran, you could see oil traffic cut off in the Persian Gulf, which could cause a real spike in oil prices and really hurt the U.S. economy. I think it's one of these countries, yeah, that if you really think about a real direct conflict and how things could escalate, calmer heads in the Pentagon and elsewhere kind of map these things out. And that's why I think it's similar with North Korea. You hear often, we should take out North Korea's nuclear capabilities. We should take out their missile capabilities. That we've been talking about that for decades. But when you really kind of outline what the response could be, which would be the pulverizing of Seoul, it doesn't happen. And I think it's similar with Iran. They've been pretty adept at not having a huge military, but deploying these assets across the Middle East, whether it's on the borders of Israel, this Persian Gulf, these militias in Yemen and Iraq. They have a capability to really retaliate. So I think that's why you see what's basically low intensity conflict, with the Soleimani hit being maybe a pretty an apex in this conflict, but it hasn't really gone into full scale war for the reasons I just said.
Yeah, I couldn't imagine a war between Iran and the U.S. being similar to the Vietnam War. Maybe similar in the sense that it would drag out, but I would think the regional impact alone would be much greater because, like you said, there is a major pathway that Iran can block off when it comes to oil trade, and then again you have the Saudi oil output, which could be hindered by the Iranians in a war like that. And again, it would also entangle the remainder of the Middle East into the conflict, possibly with Israel, Lebanon, Syria, and then you have the external components, which are Russia and China, who have incredibly strong investments and connections with the Iranian regime. So if they got brought into a conflict with the U.S., it would probably kind of spiral out of control. So I think, from my perspective at least, that's what's most preventing the U.S. from starting a direct conflict with Iran. It's that if that happens, Russia and China would both get drawn into it, and they don't want that,
Yeah, it's a possibility. I mean, I also think if there was a conflict, this wouldn't be Iraq. We wouldn't be like, it would be like, I think it would be a lot like the first Gulf War, where we basically, the first Gulf War, we pulverized Saddam Hussein's military capabilities. I think how many people we lost? Not a lot of people in the first Gulf War, and made no real efforts to sort of take the country over. I think if this thing was to escalate, yeah, it would probably be a massive U.S. air attack, and we could probably take out their navy and most of their naval assets really quickly. Iran does not have a sophisticated or navy. They have kind of asymmetrical capabilities, but as far as taking out naval destroyers or naval ships or taking out air defenses, I think we could do that pretty quickly. The question is then what would happen? It would probably be some of the stuff we've been talking about, which would be asymmetrical responses from the Iranian side.
Do you think they have any capabilities that we might not know about, or are they more technologically capable than the rest of the world thinks they are? Because again, they are well connected to the Chinese and the Russians, and you would think that they might have some level of support, whether it be militarily or technologically, from those countries as well.
I think they have good cyber capabilities. Definitely, I mean they've been building up their ballistic missile capabilities, and I still think they're pretty close. Where they've been, despite the nuclear deal with the Obama administration, they were still kind of pursuing on a path that would give them a latent nuclear weapons capability, even if they weren't going to overtly display it. But yeah, I
Mm-hmm.
think cyber use of these proxy militias. I mean, they could probably do a lot. They would shoot a lot of missiles into Israel if things escalated using their presence in Lebanon and now in Syria. So, I don't think they have some crazy surprise capability that either the Russians or the Chinese gave them, but certainly those two countries. I mean, when I was researching my book on Iran, that there were Russian scientists, one in particular, who definitely had been spending a lot of time in Tehran and looked to be helping them develop an implosion device for a nuclear weapon.
Mm-hmm.
A scientist named Danilenko. So that's a pretty good example of that. And that, yeah, in a lot of ways, it's the North Koreans probably even more than the Chinese and the Russians who might, if there was some sort of secret transfer, I would argue it probably would come from North Korea, which has shown a total willingness to sell both nuclear and other capabilities to countries. So that has been one of the real concerns in the U.S. is what exactly have the North Koreans shared with the Iranians that maybe we don't know about.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's still like an incredibly hot topic, especially when it comes to Hassan Rouhani's comments that Iran has no plans and will never want to pursue a nuclear weapon. Yet, on the contrary, there's consistent evidence that keeps surfacing that the regime is still pursuing those weapons. I mean, you have those two recent facilities that were brought up about Iran shielding them or hiding them.
The
And
Israelis, the Israelis raided and found a whole trove of files, and there was even some what they believe would be nuclear materials that were sort of stored and not reported by the Iranians. So yeah, there's the thing about the nuclear deal, even if Trump had stuck with it and the Iranians abided by it, the path that they were pursuing would give them kind of a nuclear weapons capability legally, or at least they would have been able, if the deal had survived or if it survives, they'll be able to enrich uranium on an industrial scale and enrich to levels that are weapons grade. And we know they have pretty advanced ballistic missile systems, and we know that they were testing nuclear weapons devices. So if you put those three capabilities together, even if they don't come out and kind of overtly test a weapon like
Mm-hmm.
India and Pakistan did in the 90s, I think if you're Saudi Arabia or Turkey or some of those rivals, that they'll basically assume that Iran has a nuclear weapon capability.
Exactly. It doesn't make sense why you would have one without the other. I mean, where there's smoke, there's fire. And I know Trump mentioned originally that the Iranian deal was a terrible deal and unilaterally pulled the U.S. out of it because, at least from what I've read, that deal was terrible because of a multitude of different facets of it. Basically, the JCPOA only forced them to permanently reduce or limit the capacity of the Natanz enrichment facility, and they were only allowed to enrich to 20% for energy purposes. So that does not account for the other 12 or so secret facilities that they had within and around certain cities in Iran. I believe it was Tehran specifically, which has an incredibly dense anti-air system there. So I mean, it kind of, again, it speaks to the whole, there's smoke, where there's smoke, there's fire. So
Yeah, I honestly, I think the JCPOA was like kind of it was a bet. The Obama, I think the Obama administration was really worried in 2012 that the Israelis might actually bomb the Iranian facilities and we would get dragged into some bigger conflict. And the deal was kind of, I would argue it was more like a truce that they were hoping, okay, we'll kind of de-escalate with the Iranians. Uh, we'll cap their nuclear program for a decade or so, and hopefully during that time, you'll get a more moderate Iranian leadership, and the supreme leader Khamenei will die, and in 10 years when these capabilities are more when these caps are coming to an end, maybe we'll be able to, either we won't care as much that they have these capabilities because it won't be as radical, or we'll be able to renegotiate with some more moderate regime. It wasn't a crazy. I mean, I never thought it was like a crazy bet. I just think there hadn't been any signs that the Iranians were moderating, and the real downside of the JCPOA was that it really did handcuff the U.S.'s ability to push back against Iran in their regional operations, whether it's supporting and entrenching Assad in Syria, or supporting the Houthis in Yemen, or building up Hezbollah in Lebanon. The terms of the deal basically said, you couldn't really inflict any financial pain on Iran anymore because you had this nuclear deal. So then you were basically only left with either kinetic or military operations or doing nothing. And I think the Obama crowd basically said they stood down and basically didn't do anything to stop the Iranian advancement into Syria and into Yemen. And I think a big part of it was that they were constrained by the terms of the JCPOA.
mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it's a terrible deal all around, and I think Obama overall was the individual that kind of came out unscathed from it, because at the end of the day, you're only temporarily limiting Iran from pursuing a nuclear weapon. I mean, of course, you're sanctioning the country 7 ways to Sunday, and it's, in many ways, it's a radical regime. From what I've heard, the people there are amazing, the country there is amazing, but the regime itself is highly radical. And how do you know how long it's going to take for that to become somewhat more moderate? I mean, that could be 5 years down the road, 10 years down the road, 20 years down the road, and by that time they could have the capabilities to develop and manufacture a nuclear weapon and use it within the region, much like North Korea has it as a form of deterrence against the U.S.
That was the real risk. I think there's a lot of uncertainty or questioning of what the Trump policy is on Iran, but I think it's pretty clear. And there was a former Trump administration official, Rich Goldberg, who wrote a piece in the New York Times this week. It's basically, put as much financial pressure on them as possible. If they come back to the negotiating table, great. If not, you're gonna just keep trying to choke them of the monies and the capabilities to do what they've been doing in the region, and to expand their nuclear and missile program. That's the policy. People will disagree with it, but I don't think it's a mystery. I think that's it.
Mm-hmm. And I think the Iranians are more or less waiting to see if Trump wins the re-election for a second term, because if he does, then that kind of forces them to the table, because as many know, and I personally can't say I'm a Trump supporter, but he is a very, very good businessman and negotiator, and you could tell that he plays a lot of hardball with foreign policy or foreign countries, especially with North Korea as of late, and as you've seen with Iran. So if he is reelected, it might force him to play ball, but at the same time, what happens between now and then? Because the replacement for General Qasem Soleimani. I believe his name is Eshmal Ghani. He says he's vowing revenge against the U.S. and that could be drawn out like a slow lit match. I mean, you don't know between now and the election what can happen.
Yeah, I mean, what's interesting, if you read the some of the press reports on Soleimani, one of the top U.S. officials who was pressing Trump to go ahead with the assassination was Gina Haspel, the head of the CIA, and I could tell you from reporting that there is like a blood feud between the CIA and the
blood feud.
Well, I mean, there was this like I'm raising it because, like you said, these things can play out over a long time. But
Uh-huh.
you know, the assassination, there was the Hezbollah blew up the U.S. embassy in Beirut in 1983,
Mhm.
and their intelligence was so good that they killed, I forgot how many senior CIA officials. Essentially, there was a meeting being held by kind of the regional heads of the CIA in Beirut, and one of the guys there was a really senior CIA official named Robert Ames, and Hezbollah blew up the embassy and killed them all. I mean, they clearly knew they knew what they were doing. They were they were not just blowing up the embassy; they were taking out the CIA's brain trust. So I think there's ever since '83, there's been a real inside the CIA, a real kind of it's like a blood feud, a desire for revenge, and Soleimani probably wasn't involved directly in the '83 attack, but certainly the Revolutionary Guard, or what would become the Revolutionary Guard, was central to it. So I could see why Gina Haspel might have been one of the U.S. officials pushing for the attack, knowing the history of the CIA, and maybe it will take the Iranians, whatever it was, 40 years to respond. That's kind of what seemed to have happened with the CIA, but it's an interesting that history. A lot of people don't realize that how good the intelligence was back in the '80s in Beirut, that they hit
Mm-hmm.
the embassy on the day when all these senior CIA officials were there.
How are these not considered full blown acts of war? Because think about it this way: if we kill, well, we did kill the General Qasem Soleimani, and the U.S.'s version of that would probably be considered the CIA director, maybe, or a commander of the naval forces, hypothetically. And if, yeah, so if that happened, wouldn't the U.S. technically consider that an act of war? So why hasn't this ever spiraled any further than
I mean, probably. I mean, that's why the intel about the whole attack is still so murky. The U.S. is basically saying Soleimani was deployed in a foreign government and in a foreign country and plotting attack on American installations, and the fact that our base got hit a week before, and then our embassy got stormed. You could see why that might hold, and you could say, well, he was actually in the battlefield. Um, that might be. I think that's one way people are saying it. If the head of the CIA or the head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff was in Iraq, it's himself, and the Iranians believe they were there to orchestrate attacks on the Iranians, and they hit them, they might say that's a justifiable act of war. But I think the reason it doesn't totally escalate is for the reasons we've said. Both sides kind of realize that an all-out direct war is too costly, and that we'll continue to sort of fight asymmetrically. We hit them with a financial campaign that they see as an act of war. They think the sanctions are so onerous that those are both basically the sanctions campaign is basically an act of war. And I think that's probably that's you could probably say that's true. I mean,
that?
people forget, certainly history. A lot of people forget that Pearl Harbor basically occurred because the United States had enacted a blockade around Indonesia, preventing Japan from getting its oil from Sumatra. I think they got just a huge percentage of their oil from Indonesia, and their economy couldn't support it, so they hit us in Pearl Harbor to try to block the blockade. So financial warfare is, in a lot of ways, is real warfare. So, but I think it hasn't escalated beyond that just because of the cost of a direct conflict, and we're likely to see, I would argue, just more of this, whether it's sanctions or they're hitting us or their militias hitting us with hitting us with asymmetrical rockets through their proxies are likely to continue.
I remember Mark Esper and Donald Trump both came out saying that there were imminent plans, or at least advanced plans, by Soleimani to conduct strikes on U.S. targets. I believe there were embassies in the Middle East, but there was no substantial evidence. They didn't provide any substantial evidence. Did you yourself hear anything, or have you done any research that kind of points to the contrary, or kind of provides more substantial evidence one way or another as to why Soleimani was in Iraq during that time?
I mean, there's been what I think has been a disinformation campaign from the Iranian side, where you had, Iraqi leaders saying Soleimani was there on a peace mission with Saudi Arabia. I find that pretty hard to believe. Also, Trump doesn't exactly have the best record of being honest and forthcoming, and he was saying these, claims that a bunch of other embassies were being targeted. But I don't know. I mean, if you're looking in the context, there was a rocket attack on a U.S. base that killed an American contractor. Then there was the storming of the American embassy. Those are pretty aggressive acts before Soleimani was killed. And Trump did draw a red line a few months ago, saying like the red line was Americans being killed, and if they were, there would be retaliation. And I think in that context, with them seeing Soleimani on the ground in Baghdad, and it's pretty hard for me to believe that he did not have a role in orchestrating that storming of the American embassy by those Shia militias or that rocket attack. I mean, it's that intelligence in itself, even if there wasn't sort of evidence of a bunch of other embassies being under attack. If you're sitting in this Pentagon or the CIA, maybe that's enough. And you, like I was saying earlier, this history where the Iranians have targeted us so many times and killed lots of Americans, and they never really got, hit back.
I remember reading interesting theory a couple of weeks ago, actually, on Soleimani, and I don't know what validity there is to it, but there was this idea that within the regime, Soleimani was extremely popular and well known by the public, very loved by the Iranian people for various reasons. I think one of them being he helped eliminate ISIS in the region. But I guess there must have been some internal strife within the regime, and there was rumors that he was mounting a stake or a claim for, I guess, rule of Iran, and he was going to pull off a coup. And from there, the Iranian regime and the U.S. perpetrated a plan to eliminate him while also overtly throwing, I guess, a minimal conflict together, as we've seen with the ballistic missiles and the restrained retaliation by both sides on that. What are your thoughts on that being a possibility?
I mean, I don't know if there's a coup per se, but we know that the supreme leader, Khamenei, is not in great shape. He's 80, he's had cancer. I don't know. He had prostate cancer. At that age, you're probably still fighting it for the rest of your life. So I think there's a lot of positioning inside Iran for the post-Khamenei future, and that's definitely playing out. There are parliamentary elections coming up. Rouhani, I think, is one of the President Rouhani is one of the officials who is probably in that power grab. Soleimani's in there, so I don't know if there would be an all-out coup, but certainly there's jockeying going up for the next, whether it's to be the next supreme leader or just to be the paramount figure. I mean, there's a good chance that the next supreme leader might not be that powerful and might just be kind of under the thumb of the Revolutionary Guard. And Soleimani, if he was alive, probably would have been, one of the IRGC people who would have that most control. So definitely there was efforts to marginalize Rouhani. Whether there was a move for a coup, outright coup, I'm a little skeptical. I do think there was definitely moves to be the most powerful figure once the current supreme leader goes.
Hmm. So we all know about the recent tragedy of the Ukrainian airline, which killed 176 people on board, and that was after Iran's retaliation. And there was some recent articles on this about how there was a cover up or attempted cover up in Iran about this. Supposedly, one of the commanders of the anti-air missiles actually pulled the trigger because he couldn't get into direct communication with any of his commanders themselves. So that ends up resulting in the death of 176 people, the cover up, and now Iran finally admitted that they shot down the plane. What do you think happens next from that? Because I remember in 1988, Iran Air Flight 655 ended up being shot down by the U.S. Navy by accident. So it's happening once more, basically.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's the difference is it really exposes, like you said, whether fissures inside of Iran, questions about just how capable Iran is, how competent they are. I mean, it's one thing to be kind of doing this low cost asymmetrical warfare. There's another thing about state of the art overt warfare, and the fact that their chain of command, their military, kind of seems to have confused. Whether it was whether Americans were attacking that led to this mistake in the shooting down of the Ukrainian jet, or yeah, just miscommunication. It raises real questions. I think I haven't. I think that a key part of that, one of the stories today in the New York Times, was that Rouhani had essentially threatened to resign if the IRGC didn't come out and admit that they shot it down. I mean, I think definitely this tragedy could play into Iran's domestic political jockeying, because, like as I was saying, there are parliamentary elections coming out. I could see Rouhani's people trying to use the tragedy as a way to climb back and get some power, because they've seemed to be getting a bit marginalized with the JCPOA kind of unraveling. And this could be, if the New York Times story is right, that Rouhani is trying to use this tragedy to gain back some power. But yeah, it does expose fissures in that regime. I mean, it was interesting, the coverage, because after Soleimani was assassinated, the narrative, particularly in the liberal press, was, oh, we've unified Iran. The people are now unified after months of protest, and this will strengthen the regime. But now it seems it's the opposite. While there was some rallying around Soleimani, now there are these protests against the regime and their handling of the airplane tragedy, and we see signs internally of it's filtering through to domestic politics. So I think, yeah, when the U.S. mistakenly, or the shooting down of the Iran air flight in 1988, that too, like you said, that too did have real ramifications. The horrible part was so many innocent civilians got killed. But the then Supreme Leader Khomeini basically said he ended the Iran-Iraq War because he thought the shooting down of that Iran air flight was planned by the Americans, and that more of this was to come. So in both cases, these tragedies do have rippling geopolitical and political fallout.
Mm-hmm. And it is quite the mess now in Iran. A lot of the recent events did backfire on them, as they kind of have those protests going on in the country. And there's been numerous stories of Iranian individuals in specialized fields, or who are well renowned as athletes, have fled the country and have kind of sworn not to return for various reasons. So it kind of goes to show that there is a bit of volatility going on within the regime, and it's not as stable as they kind of make it out to be to anyone outside of Iran.
Yeah, no, I agree. There was one of the real stars, an Olympic athlete, recently defected. There's some stalker stars. it's kind of I think I find Iran pretty ironic because somebody who's been there, it is like I think it's different in a lot of ways that people expect it to be. It's not like Afghanistan. It's not like some sort of failed state.
Mm-hmm.
It's a pretty modern economy and modern country, but at the same time, there's just this massive brain drain. People don't see opportunity there, whether it's because of sanctions or just the restrictions on what women can do, or restrictions on lifestyle, and that's why you see so many here in the United States. And I think it's weird in the political dimension because I don't know if some people glorify Iran, but it's kind of raised as this leader of resistance to the United States and to American imperialism. But when you really see it, the best and the brightest don't want to be there,
Right.
and there's a reason for that. And yeah, we've seen more of that in recent weeks.
Hmm. And one of the craziest statistics I found about Iran is that I think they're in the top five of nations in the world with engineers and scientists that have graduated. That's an incredible number compared to a lot of other countries such as the United States, China, Russia, Germany, Israel, um, a lot of other European countries, that they would be in the top five of countries producing a lot of scientists and engineers. So for them to all leave or want to defect to other countries, it's a telling sign basically of what is going on there right now.
Yeah, I mean, you can see if you just look at the Iranian diaspora in this country, they're incredibly successful. And from medicine to, like you said, computer engineering, um, they're just a very extremely successful and affluent um, diaspora in this country. And you can imagine if their country was open and had a normal system, what that type of talent could do. But
Hmm.
yeah, it's not hard to see if you're in Los Angeles. They're all over the place and prospering, and it's in a lot of parts of the country. So that's the one of the tragedies of Iran is that yeah, they're best and the brightest don't want to be there,
Hmm.
even though they miss it. I mean, they're very nationalistic. I think
Right.
it's interesting talking to Iranian Americans here because most of them aren't fans of the regime, but there was kind of this nationalist almost support for the Soleimani as a defender of Iran's borders, as you were saying, as someone who fought against ISIS and someone who's seen as fighting against the Arab countries that have historically been Iran's enemies. There is a kind of a nationalist support for them amongst Iranian Americans who don't necessarily love the regime.
Hmm. I wanted to quickly turn our attention again to the nuclear program, as there was a recent news article that came out about Iran threatening to quit the NPT, which is the Nuclear Proliferation Treaty. It Non-proliferation treaty. Thanks. If the program was referred to the UN, so if they were to do so, what would they even gain from withdrawing?
Yeah, I don't believe it. I think it's hot air. I think they know they'd be so isolated internationally.
Hmm.
I don't know what they'd gain from pulling out of the NPT. I mean, as they're members of the NPT. They're members of the International Atomic Energy Agency. They're as a member. I mean, even before the JCPOA, and this is what people kind of don't fully understand. Even before the JCPOA, there were IAEA inspectors inside of Iran, monitoring the big facilities, whether it's Natanz, where they produce uranium enrichment, whether it's Isfahan, another nuclear facility, this Iraq, not Iraq, but Iraq, ARAK, where they have a nuclear plutonium reactor. There were facilities there. So I think the threat is, wow, if we pull out of the NPT, the international community will be completely blind as to what we're doing. And, you know, this is bad. I still think it is a threat. They don't want to become North Korea. I mean, North Korea did pull out of the NPT in 2002 and, just became completely isolated. I've never thought that Iran wants to go that way to be that much of an international pariah.
Really, I would always think that if Iran is backed into such a corner, similar to how North Korea was, they would kind of go rogue in a sense. Now I know that the people there aren't for that, but I would assume that the regime itself would kind of do a 180 and focus on developing a nuclear strategy similar to Korea if they're kind of their backs are against the wall and they know they have to fight at that point, because I know it's worked for North Korea up till this point. I mean,
I guess the difference though is North Korea really. I mean, I've been to North Korea. I've been to Iran. North Korea is a completely isolated state. Their population is completely under the thumb of the government. It's a giant cult. Iran is definitely a much more open society where the people are, they have a
mhm.
pretty good understanding of what's going on outside of their borders to some extent. And if the regime took steps that completely isolated them, and they traditionally do have pretty good contacts with Europe.
Mhm.
If they did pull out of the NPT, I think it would be pretty hard for European countries to still trade with them. I don't know what the Chinese. I'm sure the Chinese and Russians would still find some way not to completely cut them off. But I mean, you
Mhm.
might be right. They could just go totally rogue, but I still think these are threats they're lodging to make sure. There's a whole mechanism that if, and this happened before, if the IAEA concludes that Iran is kind of in violation of its obligations, they'd refer it to the UN Security Council, and conceivably there can be
Mhm.
sanctions on, UN sanctions, which means everyone has to take part. Iran, Russia,
Yeah.
China, blah blah blah, and they don't want this to become a Security Council issue again, like it was before the JCPOA. But
Mhm. And I think that's a pretty valid thought that Iran nor the Europeans would want to destroy that NPT uh, agreement that they have in place. I know that France, among others, was very, very vocal about their support of bringing the Iranians to the table and coming to a solution on how to keep the NPT alive, and even going so far as to find ways to steer loopholes around a lot of the sanctions that were in place by the United States.
the French in particular have been. Macron had his plan a few months ago where he wanted to basically say, all right, Iran, you stop escalating on the nuclear file. Uh, you U.S. stop employing any new sanctions, and We'll go back to negotiations for a new JCPOA, and we'll give Iran 15 billion credit line to keep their economy going. So that was kind of the most pronounced effort by Europe, I think, to try to get Iran, loopholes, whatever you want to call it. Uh, that was the most, but I think they'll continue to do that. I don't know what's happened in recent days since Soleimani, but I'd be surprised if the French don't again try to intervene to try to change that. It's interesting. They're definitely splits in between inside the Trump administration too. I mean, there's definite hawks like uh, Secretary Pompeo, CIA Director Haspel seems to be pretty hawkish, but Secretary of Treasury for one, Mnuchin, I know he was really pushing for the U.S. to support this French plan
Mm-hmm.
to get back to the negotiating table and to give Iran essentially a credit line. That this infuriated some of the Trump advisors who would see such a effort as letting them off the hook. Trump was tweeting again today that we're ready for negotiations, but that doesn't mean we're going to lift the sanctions before that. So it's there's definitely fissures on this side too.
Right, and I don't think Trump wants war. I think forced or fired John Bolton, and John Bolton's well known as or as being a war hawk within that administration, almost pushing Trump to go to war with Iran at that point. So I know there are some cooler heads within that administration that just do not want war. They do not want to see the U.S. get involved in another conflict outside the region. And I know Trump, being a businessman, would prefer to continue to improve the economic situation in the U.S. as opposed to dragging the U.S. into another war, which might be detrimental to the whole cause.
Yeah, I mean, there's a huge security cost and there's a huge economic cost, which is why I mentioned Mnuchin, because I think I think he's constantly worried that you know a conflict will drive up oil prices because it could hurt the economic recovery, it's not even a recovery at this stage; it's economic expansion going into the election. And there's also talk about by employing these type of sanctions, will other countries try to create financial systems that are less dependent on the dollar,
Mm-hmm.
which might not be good for the U.S. economy or U.S. global leadership long term. So the Iran issue has always been so fascinating because there's just so many different elements to it. There's straight geopolitics, there's oil, there's economics, there's religion, there's power, international power politics. It's a conflict that draws so much into it, which is why I think it's remained on the front pages for so long.
Right. I'm not sure if you're following North Korea up until the end of last year, but I remember Kim Jong Un coming out and announcing that they had a big Christmas present to the U.S. if they didn't come back to the negotiation tables and make some concessions to the regime. And ultimately, as far as I know, nothing ever happened post Christmas. Any thoughts on that?
I mean, not knowing anything specific, but those people are so. It's Iran, North Korea's game plan is so clear. I mean, it was either going to be some sort of missile test, long range, or a nuclear test. I'd assume. I mean, that's whenever they feel like they're being ignored, that's the North Korean game plan. Is they do something provocative. So I mean, the talk. I mean, it's the Trump's North Korea policy is. It's on the one hand, I thought he was bananas to ever think he was really going to get North Korea to de-escalate to denuclearize. That's we've been trying that for 4 decades, 5 decades. It never happens. Uh, it's so I always thought he was unbelievably naive to think that. At the same time, when he came into office, people were worried that there was going to be a war, and he did de-escalate things at least for a while. He got Americans released who were in prison there from North Korea. He got the remains of POWs returned. So I don't know if you could call his North Korea policy a complete failure. He did reach some objectives that I know even the Obama administration wanted to get those people back. They wanted those remains back. So it's like North Korea, like Iran. They're so I don't envy any U.S. government, whether it's Republican or Democrat, because they're very difficult
Mm-mm.
regimes to deal with. There's no doubt about that.
So, what are your overall thoughts on the potential impact to the Middle East? And we can include North Korea in that question as well in the short term future.
I mean, to me, the most important short term impact is Iraq. You know, the Iranians want to drive us out of Iraq, and the initial fallout of the worst initial fallout from Soleimani's assassination, I think, were these calls from Iraqi leadership, politicians, for the U.S. having to pull out their troops out of Iraq. I'm still skeptical. I think for political reasons, a lot of Iraqis had to say that. I still think probably a big part of the Iraqi political establishment does not want the U.S. to leave, because then they'd be, almost totally dependent on Iran, which is not what they want. But I think in the shortest term, to me, the biggest kind of issue to watch is what happens in Iraq, and does Iran successfully use the Soleimani assassination to push us out of Iraq? On a wider scale, I think, yeah, all this stuff. Do they keep hitting us? Like these rocket attacks we saw in Baghdad, or does the pressure eventually lead to negotiations? I'm with you. I think the most likely scenario for the next year is going to be more kind of low intensity asymmetrical conflict between the U.S. We'll keep ratcheting up sanctions. They might continue to shoot missiles here and there, but I think the Iranian leadership is firmly watching our political space, because I think pretty much every Democratic politician has vowed to return to the JCPOA, which would mean the lifting of the sanctions that we've put in place, and I think the Iranians want that, so I think they're gonna closely watch our politics. But if there are signs that Trump is going to get reelected and this financial war is going to continue, I mean that's that's going to be, the Iranians will really have to make a decision. Do they have some cover that allows them to go into negotiations with Trump despite the pressure, or at that point do they say, gosh, we can't absorb another 4 years of this on our economy, so and we can't talk to this guy, so we're going to really escalate. But I would bet, my sense would be you'd see kind of just this low level continued violence, financial pressure until our political cycle becomes clearer.
And I think another important thing to really pay attention to closely is the unveiling of the U.S.'s Middle East plan, a peace plan between, I think, Israel and Palestine, because if it allows Israel to annex the West Bank, that might cause some potential challenges if Egypt or Jordan decide to use that as a reason to back out of any peace agreement with Israel. And that might cause some turmoil in the Middle East even before the elections occur in the U.S.
It'll be interesting to watch. I mean, there was the situation in the Middle East is so shifted a lot in recent years, where I think the big Arab states, whether it's Saudi or Egypt, are more worried in a lot of ways about Iran and their proxies per se than they are about solving the Palestinian issue. There was a lot of talk of unrest or geopolitical discord after Trump moved the U.S. embassy to Jerusalem, and there really wasn't much. I mean, there was some protest. I think the Saudis in particular, and probably the Egyptians, aren't going to love some totally twisted peace plan that's never going to work. I think in a lot of ways it would be the Jordanians that are in the most difficult situation. That 60% of Jordan is Palestinian. The Hashemite kings have always been in a bit of a difficult situation, whether it was King Hussein or now King Abdullah, being these essentially Bedouin rulers sitting on top of a Palestinian mass. So I think Jordan could probably be in the most difficult situation if this peace plan comes out and it's as one-sided as a lot of people fear.
Yeah, I agree on that. I mean, a lot of people are saying that peace agreement's going to be dead on arrival, essentially. But like you said, it's not going to impact the region as much as people say. And I know recently Saudi Arabia just announced that they're going to allow limited visitation by Israelis to their country. So, I mean, you could see some potential partnerships becoming more apparent between some of these countries.
No, it's been pretty dramatic. If you look at the Israeli relationship with particularly these Gulf Arab states, whether it's the UAE, whether it's Bahrain, whether it's Saudi Arabia, Oman, not Qatar so much, but yeah, you see Israeli officials go into the UAE pretty regularly. You see, I think there was a picture of maybe the Bahraini foreign minister with either Netanyahu or some other senior Israeli, and if Netanyahu loses and is eventually out of office, I think a lot of these Arab states might think it's even easier to reach out to Israel because Netanyahu has been such a polarizing figure. So that's going to be, like you said, there's just so much stuff happening at once: the Israeli election, the Middle East peace, the Iranian parliamentary elections, and then the acceleration of our political situation. Because I'm sure the Iranians, they think Bernie Sanders is going to become president, or Warren. They think, wow, we're in a position to really de-escalate with the U.S. So why do we want to spark a war 10 months before an election that might cause such a dramatic shift inside the U.S.?
Yeah, definitely going to be an exciting next year or so. So definitely a lot of things to look out for. That said, before we go, any cool projects that you're currently working on that you can share with listeners?
I'm working on a project that is far removed from the Middle East, believe it or not. It's about you'll like this. It's so the Secretary of State of the Confederacy during the Civil War was a Jewish lawyer from New Orleans named Judah P. Benjamin, who escaped after the fall of Richmond and made it to England, where he became counsel to Queen Victoria. But unbeknownst, or history isn't really focused on, is the fact that he also ran the Confederate Spy Service, the Secret Service, and a couple of years after the war, it wasn't the Union anymore, but the U.S. government tried to capture Benjamin in London because of the belief that he was involved in the Lincoln plot to kill President Lincoln. So it's a story about this really important American politician, attorney, and the Secretary of State of the Confederacy who escapes, and the reasons why he escaped.
Wow, that should be an awesome read. Any ideas when you're planning on releasing that?
Get a little bit. I'm still the trick is it's a lot different than the Iran project. That most of the documents and the stuff is right in front of you. This is finding stuff that happened. I want it to be about kind of like a whodunit, a murder mystery 160 years after it happened. And so I've been finding documents in the Library of Congress, that track stuff from that time, and I probably got to go over to England to look a little bit more. So I'm making progress, but it's going to take a little bit more time.
Yeah, so a bit ways down the road, but yeah. So yeah, nonetheless, always a pleasure to have you on the show, Jay Solomon. Always great to talk to you, especially with your knowledge on this topic. So if anybody's interested in following you on Twitter, they can find you at Jay Solomon, and I believe you have a website as well, and that is jsolomon.com. So again, thank you so much, Jay. Always a pleasure.
Thanks a lot, Tasha.
Thanks again, everyone, for tuning into this episode of the All Things Interesting podcast with my guest, Jay Solomon, to talk more on the foreign affairs and the ongoings of the Middle East. It was an exciting episode to kind of get an expert opinion as to what is currently happening and what is the possible fallout in the region as well as globally. So always a great time having him on the show. If anyone is interested in learning more about Jay Solomon, you can find him on his website, j-solomon.com, or you can find him on Twitter at jsolomon, which I'll be posting links to in the description of the show, which is usually found on my website, teshercohen.com. If you enjoyed the episode, subscribe on iTunes, Google Play, Spotify, or your favorite podcast hosting platform, and drop a comment. Thanks again, and stay tuned for more episodes of the All Things Interesting podcast.